Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's Research America Alliance member web meeting, our first of 2021, and quite a 2021 it's been. I'll leave it at that. Thank you, as always, for being Alliance members and for your partnership and for joining us today. Since we're using Zoom's webinar format, you're going to be muted for now. During the presentation, feel free to put questions in the Q&A box at any time, and my colleague Terry Schwartzbeck will ask them during the Q&A. After Dr. Tabak and Dr. Lauer speak, please also feel free to use the raise your hand function and we'll unmute you to ask questions. My guess is we'll have a lot of questions, so we'll see how all this goes. But speaking of Dr. Tabak and Dr. Lauer, I am thrilled to let you know that both Dr. Tabak and Dr. Lauer have joined us today. Dr. Tabak, as I know you know, is the Principal Deputy Director of the NIH, and he also is the Deputy Ethics Counselor at the agency. Dr. Lauer is the NIH Deputy Director of Extramural Research. Larry and Mike, thank you so much again for joining us. And I am going to stop there and, ask you to make some remarks.
Well, thanks very, very much. We really appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak to the members of the Alliance. I think to say that last week was a week unlike any other is it's a gross understatement. I'm sure the events had a tremendous impact on all of you. For those of us who live so-called in the Beltway, the effects were particularly profound. We all have walked those halls. Some of us know people who were trapped inside. It was, to say the least, quite sobering. But all that said, of course, we have to keep our focus, maintain our discipline to ensure that we meet the needs of all of our stakeholders in the extramural community. Mike and I want to maximize the time for questions, so we'll keep our comments quite brief. I'll just give you, very high-level overview, and then Mike can give you some specific steps that he's already undertaken to help early career scientists in particular. At present, and I'm sure you're all familiar with this, the last supplement did not include specific funds for working through some of the challenges that extramural investigators are facing. But as I've said to this group before, we are nevertheless committed to doing what we can to try and redress some of these challenges. So at present, each institute and center at NIH is going to have to look at this from their unique perspective in terms of their objectives and scientific priorities and so forth. But as a whole and in general, there are three priorities that we will support, and that is in part informed by the extramural survey that was conducted, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So the first priority is early career scientists, and that includes trainees, career development awardees, and early stage investigators. The second category are established investigators, who are obviously performing meritorious work that is at risk for losing all funding. And then, depending upon the institute or center, I'm sure there will be certain high priority clinical trials in which the completion of enrollment is crucial, or the follow-up is crucial for the project's success. And that, of course, will take more of an individual institute and center by institute and center approach. Um, Now again, because we don't have um, additional resources, we will have to, obviously reprioritize what we already have, which is significant, and we're very grateful for that. But that means that institutes and centers may look at this in somewhat slightly different ways. But those categories are the things that we think rise to the top. Let me turn it to Mike to perhaps describe some of the things specifically that are already being done to help the early career scientists.
Thanks, Larry. Yeah, I'm off of mute. Okay, thanks, Larry. So, as Larry said, one of our key priorities are early career investigators. These are the people who are potentially most vulnerable to the adverse effects of the pandemic. We're going to be releasing more detailed results about the extramural survey. We received responses from 46,000 researchers, which is absolutely fabulous. But one theme that we have seen, and I don't think this is in any way surprising, is that early career investigators are most concerned that the pandemic is having a negative effect on their career trajectory. So there are a number of steps that we are taking. Some are steps that we had already planned, and others are more related to the pandemic. One is the so-called Stephen Katz Award. This is an interesting program. This is an R01 award for early career investigators or early stage investigators who will send in applications that have no preliminary data. They're interested in a change in research direction, and therefore no preliminary data will be allowed. We're very excited about this. We'll see how well this works out. The first application date will be later this month, but we'll be accepting applications at usual points later on in the year. The second is that we already have processes in place by which early stage investigators can extend their eligibility for being considered an early stage investigator. So, for example, childbirth or military service, these are examples of situations where one can get an extension. We have expedited these processes to make them easier. Um, because of the pandemic, we are allowing people to submit preliminary data after the submission of the application. That's something that we normally do not allow, but we are allowing this. Preliminary data has to be submitted more than 30 days before the study section meets, but after the submission of the application. Another big concern that researchers have, and particularly researchers who are more early career, is whether or not review is going to penalize them because their productivity of late has not been quite as good. And so we've actually issued explicit instructions to reviewers to disregard situations that are directly related to COVID-19 and to explicitly disregard temporary declines in productivity related to the pandemic. One way in which you could help us is to remind people that we have said this, and we've put this in the NIH guide, and we want to take every opportunity to remind people of that. And finally, we do allow, and we have always allowed, no-cost extensions for research, career, and training awards. There are some constraints on those, but we have allowed them for quite a while, and we have implemented some expedited processes. These do have to be handled on a case-by-case basis, but the idea is that we want to make this as simple and straightforward as possible. The last thing that I will mention is that, as Larry said, some ICs are already doing some specific outreach that's worth knowing about. NIMH, the National Institutes of Mental Health, posted a notice in the guide, I think it was just before the Christmas break, in which they talk about their approach towards administrative supplements because of COVID-related losses. If you haven't seen it, I would encourage you to take a look at it. It calls for people who are in the last year of their awards to describe some of the types of losses that they've had. And then there are some ICs that are also already reaching out to trainees, so people on F awards and people on career development awards or K awards, asking them to indicate whether or not they are requesting an extension, and if so, whether or not the extension is a no-cost extension or a funded extension or a partially funded extension. So this is already being done. We already have the wherewithal to do this. It's of course all a matter of what resources are available and what's what's possible. So some ICs are already doing that. So those are my comments, and look forward. Again, I want to echo what Larry said, and thank you for all the great work that you're doing, and happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thanks to both of you. Actually, I'm gonna start and then turn to what I'm sure are many audience questions. I'm trying to kind of do the math. I have two questions kind of around the math. One is these three priorities related to COVID in and of themselves could absorb a lot of money based on the estimates of the lost dollars that I think Dr. Collins made last summer of $10 billion. Have you all been working on a re-estimate of what you expect the gaps in funding are now?
So yeah, we're not the only ones who've been looking at this. There was a very interesting piece that was put out by COGR, the Council on Governmental Relations. They put out a white paper last August. It's a thoughtful, I'll call it semi-quantitative thought exercise in which they went through a variety of scenarios. So one scenario, which is the one that we basically used back last spring, early summer, was one in which there was a period of dramatic declines in productivity for several months and then a gradual return to normal. Another one of their scenarios, which maybe this, well, it looks like is the scenario we're headed towards, is that there's a recurrent decline in productivity because the pandemic has exacerbated. And so that would increase the total losses. So yes, we have been thinking about this and coming up with re-estimates. So have others. And COGR has, AAU has. The interesting thing is that even though we're all approaching this in somewhat different ways, we're all coming up with roughly the same answer, which I guess is reassuring.
It is reassuring.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's going to be a balance. Regardless of what resource set we have, it will never be enough. I mean, let's be candid about this. So it becomes a balance between trying to redress those who are most vulnerable and who are at the most vulnerable point in their career versus, trying to do something, if you will, across the board. And I don't think that latter approach is going to be feasible. I think the three categories, that I mentioned and that Mike amplified on, are I think a very good starting point. But then there are subsets within each of those categories. So if you're only in the first year of an award, you're in a very different circumstance than somebody who's in the last year of an award.
Right.
And so we have to, parse things in that way. But we will try very hard to, work with the community, with our, grantees, to come up with hopefully the most reasonable, approaches. But again, whether we are fortunate enough to get additional resources in some additional supplemental that occurs, or if we use just the resources that we have, which are obviously substantial, which we're very grateful for, we still are going to have to do this in a way that deals with those who are most at risk.
No, I think that's right. But I'd say that I think from the community's expense, at least from my perspective and Research America's perspective, we have a responsibility, even to taxpayers, to make whole the grants that they decided in that appropriation cycle we're going to move progress forward, and then we're stalled by COVID, and a responsibility to support new research and keep it going at a pace. NIH's help in terms of technical assistance to the community and obviously to the appropriators on what they perceive as the amount of dollars that are for that unexpected piece, I think will help all of us. So I'm glad that you all are working on estimates, and and obviously we're going to be really hard at work trying to make sure there are supplemental dollars to cover those. But let me shut up now and ask Terry to start with questions that we've gotten from the audience during these remarks.
Sure thing, Ellie. And just a reminder to folks watching, you can click on the Q&A button and submit your questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. First question, Congress recently provided NIH with an additional $1.15 billion to conduct COVID research. Any sense of how the Office of the Director is planning to prioritize and disperse those funds to the different institutes?
Yeah, so this is a rather prescribed resource set to look at post-acute COVID syndrome. And that will include the so-called MISC that we observe in children. And so we are working on a trans NIH approach to this very important question. But that resource set, is prescribed, and depending upon the final form of the studies, that's how we will determine the allocation of the specific funds. But it is focused on that specific problem, a broad problem, but nevertheless a specific problem.
Great, thank you. Another question coming in. As our grad students and postdocs are losing time on their career path, is there something that could give them an accelerant to speed their next career phase? One fear is that with this loss of bench time, they may decide to leave science, as it is the only ways or means of moving on in their life trajectory.
Yeah, so I don't know, Mike, if you'd like to opine on that.
So a couple of thoughts. We're aware, for example, that survey that showed that the number of new faculty positions had declined by 70% from 2020 compared to 2019. So one are extensions to existing awards. So these include fellowship or career development awards. Some of them, from some ICs, they will be funded, probably not fully funded, but partially funded. Even if they're not funded, it's still an active award, and it means that monies that may be left over can still be spent. So that's one. I don't know whether you would call that an accelerant, but maybe a better term to call it is a cushion or a crutch. Another, which is the opposite of accelerant, but okay. And then another thought is actually the CAS award. Now the CAS award is actually truly an accelerant. The idea here is that early career investigators may feel trapped, that in order for them to get into the NIH system, they have to engage in research that is directly related to what they were doing during their training, either graduate training or postdoc training. And now that's no longer the case. We've actually created an avenue whereby if they have ideas about something that they want to do that's completely different, and they haven't had the opportunity to collect preliminary data, we will consider those ideas, and we will compete those ideas against each other. And those ideas that seem particularly intriguing, we'll go ahead and fund, even though that preliminary data is not there.
Right, and to the answer.
You must have accidentally muted your.
Sorry, yeah, thanks, Mike. The answer to Sandra's question in the chat box is that's the CATS award that Mike just referred to.
Okay.
Terry, if I could interrupt for one moment and ask a question, and it's really a fundamental question that I should have asked initially. Dr. Tabak, when you mentioned that these were your top 3 priorities, are they your top 3 priorities for the effects of COVID? Or across the institutes, are they the top 3 priorities in terms of grant awards?
I think certainly the first 2 are. Not all institutes and centers have clinical trials, as you may know.
Yes.
So it may not be fair to include that one as a top priority for all institutes and centers.
Right.
But no, I think that the first 2, surely are.
And in the second of those priorities, you mentioned grants that have nearly run out of funds. Is that what you were saying? That basically if they are at the edge?
Right. So if you have a circumstance where an individual has, a grant, it's in the final year, there and for whatever reason, they are not, quite competitive enough. I think institutes and centers will consider things like bridge awards to try and tide over, if you will, the laboratory, because obviously there's an inherent lost cost if somebody loses all their funding and then has to restart again.
Absolutely.
So, bridge award would be a good opportunity. Other ICs may use a slightly different approach, but I think that's the thought behind that.
And let me ask one more question, Terry, and then we'll turn back to you. In terms of infrastructure itself, lab capacity, clinical trial sites, independent clinical trial sites, I'd love to get from both of you just your perspective on the damage of COVID in terms of our basic infrastructure, our research infrastructure in the biomedical arena and clinical research arena.
Well, I mean, again, Mike could probably give you more detail, but obviously, with so many clinical sites not being able to operate in the research sphere, in part because clinicians had to change their priorities towards delivering clinical care.
Right.
There's been tremendous delay. In some instances, trials would have to start over. So I think there are a number of things that conspire against the sort of business as usual. That said, I hope people take pride in the fact that many of the trial networks that were typically used for other things, stepped up to do some key and critical research related to COVID in a timely manner. And so whilst we certainly are very concerned about lost productivity and attrition and people leaving because of the disruptions, we also have to take great pride in what the extramural community delivered vis-a-vis the trials that did need to be conducted for COVID. Mike, I don't know if you have any.
Yeah, I've sometimes used the term bipolar. So on the one hand, the COVID-related research accomplishments are just downright amazing. Within a very short period of time, our various networks produced, designed, implemented, executed, and published trials on treatments, prevention, and vaccines that some of them actually work, some of them don't work, but now we know that they don't work. And it's amazing how quickly all this got done. So that's amazing. Now, on the other hand, we have seen that for non-COVID related research, there have been some very real disruptions. I saw there was one VPR who showed me the clinical trial enrollment from his institution. And so you have, January, February, March, it's kind of stable. Then April, May goes way down. And then there was a bounce back. And so it actually went above where it had been before. Part of it was because of COVID trials, but part of it was because they had figured out other ways in which they could conduct their trials without having in-person visits or dramatically decreasing the number of in-person visits. So just like we've all learned to be resilient, like what we're doing right now, we're having this meeting right now, despite the fact that we're all in the comfort of our own home. The clinical trialists and clinicians have also figured out ways to get things done. Their metadata, I believe, has put out some very interesting data in which they've attempted to quantify the impact of the pandemic on the trial enterprise, and it's very real, but it's also highly heterogeneous, which is quite interesting.
Thank you. Terry?
Well, we have tons more questions, so hopefully we can get to some of these. First, a question for Dr. Lauer. Is a third-year no-cost extension possible for R01 and R21 projects if the progress of the projects is delayed due to COVID-19 pandemic-related issues, such as hiring freezes?
So second-year no-cost extensions now are much easier than they were in times past. Third-year no-cost extensions would require a lot of thought, so that those would be handled on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, great. And then another question, is there an opportunity to award supplements similar to what was done with ARRA to fund investigators and infrastructure, particularly directed to URM scholars and populations?
I think the short answer is yes, but Mike, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, it's yes, but each IC has to think it through in terms of available funds and the various priorities that they're dealing with. Some ICs are already doing that to some degree.
Okay, fast and furious. At one point earlier in the pandemic, there was a lot of talk that many more proposals had been submitted than in the past, or that they might be. Has that turned out to be the case? If so, is this straining the review process? And will it result in lowering of the success rate and maybe put more investigators at risk of losing funding?
The number of applications has gone up, not by a huge amount, but nonetheless, it's real. It's maybe about somewhere between a 5 and 10% increase in the number of applications. We've seen that for both the May and the October cycles. Of course, we'll see what happens in January. We have not seen a substantial change in the composition of the applications. In other words, the proportion of PIs who are women, has not changed. Also, where the applications are coming from, that hasn't changed by very much. We are seeing a slight increase in the number of multi-PI applications, but we think that's part of a long-term trend.
Okay, another question. Administrative supplements require that the parent grant have an active time remaining on the parent. Might NIH revisit this in regard to COVID-19 related supplements?
Okay, so the answer to that is, yes, we are awarding administrative supplements even at a time when the budget period is over, and that depends upon, there's a whole variety of permutations, and so that depends upon the specifics of the grant. And so what I would say is that you'd have to ask your grants management person about where this particular grant fits.
Okay, great. We've had some questions regarding women in the science workforce. One points out we're finding that new investigators, especially women, are leaving the workforce. Are there any strategies to engage these new and early investigators who are in the pipeline but do not yet have NIH funding?
Well, so again, are these trainees that we're referring to, or are these people who are entering trainees? I'm not quite sure where the individuals are along the metaphorical pipeline. I mean, again, as we look at people who are at risk, we are painfully aware of the fact that women and people from traditionally underrepresented groups tend to be even at greater risk than the general population of our investigators. And so we will do everything we can to redress the challenges that they're facing. Part of the reason why we're doing a lot of things on a case-by-case basis is when you've seen one challenge, you've seen one challenge. And they differ. In the course of any single day, I get emails, and each one is somewhat different. And so I can't. Well, I mean, I think the general statement is that yes, we're gonna do what we can to redress the challenge, but I think we would need a very, very long menu to articulate all the different.
Absolutely. And that particular question was addressing trainees and postdocs, but I think you covered it. Quick question along all of these lines. Are you all feeling quite strained in your ability to respond to the concerns, the questions, the uncertainty of the community? Do you feel you have the administrative resources that you need just to field what's coming in?
I think we have been. If people feel that that's not correct, they should let us know. And both my email and Mike's email are well known, and people shouldn't be bashful. But no, I think our entire grants workforce has been, working every day, working hard on behalf of all the stakeholders. And despite, some of the challenges that you all face in the extramural community, we're facing some of those as well, obviously. But no, I don't think that we've really compromised. I think all of our council meetings have gone off flawlessly. I think those research organizations that have held virtual meetings, we've done virtual consultations. The big OER regional meeting went off with, I don't know how many thousands of participants.
Yeah.
So I think we've been able to navigate, these particular challenges.
Yeah, actually, it's kind of interesting, and I think that it reflects what we've read in the newspapers about productivity of knowledge-based firms. But by various measures, if you want to look at, like, for example, the number of grants we have processed, the number of reviews we have conducted, the number of meetings we have held, our productivity has, if anything, gone up. The virtual seminar, which was a fantastic opportunity to reach out not only to early career scientists, but also to grants administrators all around the country. Our typical attendance is about 900 to 950. We had over 13,000. So the level of outreach was much greater. And ironically, we never would have tried it had it not been for the pandemic.
Right.
So of course now we're all scratching our heads saying, well, why would we ever want to go back to a physical
Honestly. That's funny. Well, Terry, I think you had one more question that I'd love to wrap up with one more quick one.
Sure thing. COVID has changed some of the structure of animal facilities. Are there funds available for modifications? G20?
Yeah, so I do not know how ORIP is going to pivot the use of those funds. We're still, pretty early in the fiscal year, and we're waiting for certain things to settle out. But we are very aware of the fact that some structural modifications will be required in some instances. And that's a good question to bring up directly to the ORIP leadership. So thank you for that.
I just wanted to thank you all for the flexibility that you are so clearly trying to provide to the research community in this situation. And also just make one pitch, and that is what keeps coming into my mind are health disparities, and also new strains of COVID and that are more transmissible. So the possibility that supplemental funds may also be needed to get at some of what's evolving and also address this incredible differential in hospitalizations and death rates by race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic factors. And I know it's on your minds too, but as NIH is providing technical assistance, I just think it was one of the things we're going to be working on in our shop too. And mostly just, we're so grateful. We saw you in September, Larry and Mike. I think, Larry, you addressed us in March. You've been so gracious and generous with time that you don't have. So I just really wanted to thank you again on behalf of the community. And if there are other questions we've gotten in, would it be okay if we sent them in written form and when you have time?
Yeah, no.
So that we can get back to folks.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in particular, there was one individual who pointed out that the CIHR is doing something specific for women. And I'd like to know more about that. And so if they don't want to contact me directly, maybe they can contact you and you can send me the information. Because I'm pretty familiar with what CIHR is doing, but maybe I've missed something, and so I would like to know more about that, please.
Absolutely. So I guess with that, we have a little bit of housekeeping to do, but you all probably have one or two things on your plate. So
one or two. Great being with you. Thanks so very much for doing this. Take care now.
Thank you. Just a couple of things I wanted to just remind you that I'm about to remind you about Georges Benjamin. There we go. On Thursday, Georges is going to come and talk everything COVID with us. vaccine distribution, the tiers, how that's working out, state by state, what's happening. These new strains that have not only, I guess they're traveling, definitely started, there was in Britain, and now Africa is having a major problem. So it's going to be just terrific to have such an expert who's in the mix right now trying to help figure all this out. Next Friday, we will be having, Steve Clemens is joining us to try to disentangle the various threads politically, legislatively, and just generally after 3 weeks of whatever this has been and will be. I'm not going to try to define it. And finally, we'll have a brainstorming session. We're going to be talking more and talking to you more, and would love to hear more from you about supplemental funding, about the asks for FY22. We'll probably be seeing budget caps discussions before long, so kind of strategy around that. Look forward to interacting with you, and hope you can always email, call me, call Sarah, call Anna, anyone on our team, and love to chat with you about anything really, but research related in particular. So thanks again, and I think we can say goodbye here.